Hey everybody, geeks and geekettes, and all you folks out there in comic book land. It's Wednesday morning. It's time for another edition of Ask Chuck Dixon, where you get to ask me, Chuck Dixon, questions about what I do for a living. And what I do for a living is I write comic books. Let's get to the first question. Michael Hutchinson, good old Hutch, says, as someone who worked under the Comics Code Authority, what was your opinion of it? Do you think that the tone of comic books has been affected by its removal, even though there are rating systems on the books, etc.? Well, for those of you who don't know about the Comics Code, let me take this opportunity to provide you with a little history. Back in the 40s and 50s, comic books were not under any kind of supervision from the outside. There was no censorship as there was for radio, television, and movies. Comics kind of relied on what they could get away with. So, post World War II, they began to push the envelope a bit, particularly on violence, quite a bit on sex, and try to, I think that in a way they are trying to read their readership, read their audience, and trying to keep that vast number of GIs who read comic books while serving in World War II, try to keep that readership. Movies and other areas of entertainment kind of grew up a little after World War II because, 5 million men in uniform, and many of them had seen stuff, they left the farm and they saw stuff they wouldn't normally have seen. They grew up quite a bit. Saw some horrible stuff, saw some wonderful stuff. But they were exposed to a greater range of human experience than the generation prior. And so they were a little more jaded when it came to entertainment and life in general, and who can blame them? And so comics tried to appeal to that feeling, and a lot of the comic book creators were vets themselves. So a lot of this new material with more violence, more sex, grew out of their own experiences. And to be fair, paperback books were exploding, and they were pretty lurid. And they were pushing the envelope on sex and violence hard. They were marketing sex and violence. And the movies were doing it to the degree that they could, given that there was a censorship office in Hollywood. But all of that party kind of came to the end when Frederick Wortham, a psychiatrist, showed up, and he wrote a little book called Seduction of the Innocent. And everybody after World War II was like really torqued up about juvenile delinquency, the rising crime amongst our youth. I given the fact that in most American cities you could walk the streets safely at 4 a.m., they would definitely see our world as post-apocalyptic when it comes to urban crime and juvenile delinquency. A couple of kids getting in fights and shoplifting and maybe a stabbing here and there. Threw the whole country into this panic. So everybody was willing to listen to anybody who could explain why this was happening and how we could stop it. And Frederick Wortham pretty much blamed it all on comic books. Ignoring puberty and hormones entirely. It's all comic books' fault. And as usual, when a public furor arises and the public gets interested in something and it hits the media, the politicians sweep in and get their little piece of the pie. So there were Senate hearings about comic books, and they were televised. And it didn't go well, particularly for the creators at EC Comics, who, quite frankly, in my opinion, I love the old EC Comics, but in my opinion, they were pushing it a little too far. They were getting a little too graphic, a little too dark, a little too nihilistic, a little too gross. And even though kids love them, and I still think they're harmless, you can't blame people who weren't used to this kind of material being shocked at the level of material that appeared in what they felt was a medium for children. They didn't appreciate the fact that EC and some of the other publishers were trying to grow comics up for an older audience. So that, and since there was no rating system, there was no system for judging the comics levels of obscenity or what was socially unacceptable. This kind of material was frowned on because the average public didn't see any difference between the Vault of Horror and a Daffy Duck comic. So the industry was kind of scared by all this because they thought that the government would come and roll over them and crush them as they had the movie industry. A lot of people don't realize this, but in these same days of Frederick Wertham and the Senate hearings on comics, the government was trying to tax the movie business out of business. I mean, they took away the ability for the studios to own movie theaters because they said it was a monopoly. Under the antitrust laws, the studios could no longer own theaters. And then they put this whopping big entertainment tax on the new theater owners because you had local businessmen and private concerns buy up theaters and theater chains from the studios at bargain prices. And then they were practically taxed out of existence by the government swooping up most of their profits with this entertainment tax. So the comic book business was, already being heavily regulated by the government. The post office determined a lot of the material you saw in comics at the time, all the way up into the 60s, because subscription comics were sent through the mail under second-class postage, which was much cheaper, obviously, than sending them first class. There was no media mail. And comics wouldn't have been able to ship media mail anyway because they had advertising. So because they were a periodical, they could be sent second-class mail. But because of that, the post office determined that they couldn't be all comics, and they couldn't feature the same character throughout. Isn't that weird? That there had to be more than one story in the comic, and it couldn't feature the same characters as the lead feature. This is government overreach. This is government micromanaging at its worst. And so comics had to have those stupid 2-page text stories, and this is before they adopted the idea of a fan page or letters page. And that's why you see a lot of these, really badly written text stories in older comics. And they had to divide the issues between, Batman and Green Arrow. We couldn't buy a comic that was all Batman or all Superman or all Captain Marvel. And so the government was already leaning on the comic book industry. And they thought, well, geez, if they bring in censorship, if there's government censorship, if we have a comic book equivalent of the FCC, we're going to be in trouble. We're going to have a new boss. And the comic business didn't want that because comic business had at that time understood you have to be nimble, you have to be able to move fast. And if there was a government bureaucracy sitting on them, they wouldn't be able to move as fast as they did before to pick up on trends and do redundant publishing and basically determine their own future. Because if you're a business, regulation is your enemy. You don't want to be regulated. You want to be able to do what you want to do when you want to do it. So Dell Comics, they were one of the first to respond. Now, Dell Comics was literally half of the comics published were Dell Comics. There were dozens of comic book publishers, but Dell was the champion. They sold lots more comics than anybody else, and they had their own distribution system. In a lot of cases, their own rack, their own comic book rack. There were some store chains and independent stores that only carried Dell Comics. They didn't carry any other comic. And Dell Comics were not in the same vein as the other comic book companies. They didn't do lurid, exploitative material. They were always very careful to do family-friendly, G-rated stuff. And they basically started their own, wholesomeness guarantee. They took out full-page ads in their own comics, which generally didn't have ads. Dell Comics were so profitable They didn't have advertising in them. They were comics from beginning to end. The comic story might end on the back cover. That's how serious they were about it. And so you get this big 52-page magazine. It's comics from beginning to end. And it was generally complied with the post office because they were never a single story. So they were in good shape. And they might have a little text piece in the middle, some cutesy little piece of children's book writing, which was generally better written than the other comic book companies. So anyway, they took out full-page ads for many years, basically saying, hey, mom and dad, don't worry. We respect your kids, we respect you, and you're never going to see any of that filthy crap that you see at the other companies in our books. So Dell never subscribed to the Comics Code. They didn't have to. But the other comic book companies, mostly led by John Goldwater at Archie, decided to all basically create their own censorship. That they hired a board to review comic book material, and this was the Comics Code Authority, and they all agreed on what this code would be. And there were some obvious things. They didn't want to show drug abuse. They didn't want to show stabbings. Any kind of nudity, any kind of suggestion of nudity, because Frederick Wertham had the public convinced that comics were created by this army of perverts trying to corrupt your children. And that's true today. I don't think it was true then. But so they came up with these very hard and fast rules. You couldn't depict kidnapping. You couldn't depict vampires, werewolves. This is very much to lock down EC comics. The good guys always had to win. Respect for parents, respect for authority, all these things, to help the comics create good citizens, to be good role models. And the problem is it kind of made the comics a bit bland because, the comic book companies, so afraid of getting into trouble, adhered to the Comics Code Authority zealously. Never pushing the envelope, never challenging it. And they didn't seem to be able to figure out how to work within the confines, with rare exceptions. Now, the Comics Code became irrelevant over time. Marvel Comics published a few comics without the code on them. Famously, a Spider-Man comic that dealt with drug addiction because they felt it was an issue that needed to be dealt with. And so after a while, the Comics Code, it kept softening its rules and regulations, and then eventually just became irrelevant. And now we have the rating system, which I think is borrowed from manga, when they published manga here in the United States, because they didn't know what to do with manga, so they had to rate it, because some of the material was kind of iffy for American audiences. There's more adult content in it. So we now have a rating system that no one understands fully. And I don't think there's anybody really regulating it. I think the rating system is voluntary. The publishers look at it and go, yeah, this is, teen plus or whatever. I don't even know what the ratings are. But when I wrote Comics Code comics, I was fine with the Comics Code Authority. It didn't bother me at all because at least I knew the framework. And I wasn't, when I was writing superhero comics at least, I wasn't trying to get away with anything. I was writing, as I always say, I was writing for a precocious 10-year-old. And I had no interest in presenting any material that would get him in trouble with his parents. So it was pretty simple for me. I liked working within the framework of the existing characters. I wasn't there to break them or change them. And I didn't mind working within the framework of the Comics Code because I was pretty much in agreement with the Comics Code. I felt I could write good stories without using 4-letter words. I know when the more mature comics came along and writers were like, oh, my writing will be so much better if I can drop F-bombs. Really? Is that what you need to make your writing better? Maybe paying more attention to believable character development might improve your work a little bit more. Logic, so, So yeah, I didn't never had a problem with the code. I was cool with it, and kind of sorry to see it go, because it was at least a baseline for what could appear in comics. And after that, nobody knew what could appear. It's willy-nilly and shifting situational morality, which is the world that we live in today.